Hi everybody, welcome back. I had uploaded a video earlier, just a few hours ago I think, about how to watch Star Wars, and that was in a sort of an impulsive video. This is the first part of a two-part video that I intended to do. I wanted to talk about three books, three kinds of fields of research I've been doing about Judaism, about my view of the deity in Judaism, my conception of it, and also talk about my upbringing as a Jew, and perhaps illuminate, enlighten you on what Judaism entails. I'm guessing that you're not Jewish. You may be Jewish, but you still, even if you are, you'll learn quite a bit. I want to talk about what my conception of a deity had been, what my conception of what Kabbalah was, and what the five books of Moses and generally the Jewish Bible was talking about during my upbringing, and and what it's changed into. I have an Amazon account. I've put on I've written some creative writing and some memoirs, and I want to do more with that. I've been adding links here and there to refer to those things that I have up for sale on Amazon, and I want to develop that further. And so creating a video like this will help me, I figure, formulate those three different primary books I've been reading, which do seem to jibe together. It seems to point to something very, very, in my opinion, very, very sublime and important for people to understand. And I want to see if they all jibe together. It's a matter of me just exploring and making sure that I check and find out whether there are any holes. I'm poking holes, I'm trying to poke holes, see if I can find any inconsistencies. Okay, let me start off so that I may end this video with just my own, just talking about my own upbringing, because that's much easier, and I may mention what those three other books are. And then I'll save the more elaborate stuff for the next video, whenever I'll film that. Okay, my upbringing. I didn't know that I was Jewish until, this is how I remember. I wasn't Jewish until about, after elementary school, going into middle school. About that time, the way I remember it is that my mom and I were walking down Oswego Street, and I guess that identifies me. Helps to identify where I am. And she tells me that I'm Jewish. That's how I remember it. The upstart is that I would have to go to Sunday school and prepare for my bar mitzvah. For those of you who don't know, a bar mitzvah is universal for Jews in general. For boys, it's age 13. For girls, it's age 12, and technically 13 years old and 1 day, as I've read it. But usually by that point you're at least that old. For girls, it's 12 years and 1 day. For boys, it's bar mitzvah. Now, let me explain what bar mitzvah means. Bar means son. Bat means daughter. Mitzvah is a variation of the term, the root word meaning tzava. As I understand it, it refers to binding, and and it's been translated as command, but perhaps the connotation, I'll have to read into it further, but it's that point where maybe Judaism is one of the more unique languages where you can have several different meanings for this word, for a given word. The connotation is that between you and someone else, there's a relationship, and it's a bound relationship. It's a relationship that's bound in some way, and these commandments, as they're translated into English, or mitzvot, is a connection between you and, I'll just say, God. I want to go further into that to explain why I'm hesitant. I don't want to call it God because the origin of the term, I think God is a German term, and it refers to something more like an imp or a creature. It's like a, I don't think it's a good term for it. But I'll just say God for right now. The divine, I'll just say God because everybody else does. It's this relationship between you or the Jewish people in general and God through these commandments. They're not a burden. That's one of the differences between Judaism and Christianity. In the past, Christianity has termed those commandments, 613 commandments, as a burden, as a heavy burden. And of course, it was in Christianity's interest to call them, to characterize them as that. And look at those Jews, they're burdened by all these commandments they have to follow, and look at us, we're Christian. It's better to leave Judaism and go to Christianity because you won't have to be burdened with all those commandments. And it's not the case. First of all, the 613, that number is a mystical number. It's 365. It's not like there is an explicit set of commandments. In the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, that's where you get those that's where you get I don't want to say all. You get a whole load of commandments. I want to mention the Talmud too, but you simply get a lot of commandments given in the 5 books of Moses. The trick is how you divide up those commandments, because in the text it could say, for example, God tells you or instructs the Israelites, meaning all the Israelites and Jews, the Jews being a subset of Israelites. And when you, hypothetically, I'm making this up as I go along, and when you go into town or whatever, upon entry into a town, or no, let me say divorce or something, it'll start off with a commandment, and then it'll follow with further commandments that relate to that first commandment. Now, at what point do you divide them up into individual commandments? That's been something I'm curious about. I know the mystical explanation for the 613, at least one of them. It's 365 commandments that you don't do, and that's obviously more than 216. It's 248. The numbers are 248 and 365. There are 365 commandments referring to things that you are not to do. There are things that are forbidden to do, and those are obviously relating. 365 relates to the number of days in the year, and 248 is supposed to be the number of body parts that a human has. I don't know how they figure out 248, but that's been the explanation. And so together they add up to 613. I wouldn't be surprised if there are other explanations for where you get 613, but it's not like every Jew has a list of 613 they've memorized. And in the 5 books of Moses, those commandments, that huge amount of commandments, doesn't refer to every Jew or every Israelite. They were given to the Israelites as a collective whole, and each member of Israel is obliged to follow them or uphold them. And a lot of them are simple things. Some of them just refer to the priests, and the priests have to follow those commandments, so they don't refer to everybody else, the rest of the Israelites. Some of them refer to women. Some of them refer to things that women should or should not do, and some of them refer to men, things that men should or should not do. So collectively, as a whole, there are like quote 613 commandments. So, where was I? So, all right. So bar mitzvah. So that's the connection with God. This relationship, special relationship with God, and the Jewish view of this is that studying, the Jews are nothing if not creative, imaginative, smart, and curious. So you may have picked up these tropes before about Jews, common stereotypical traits about Jews. They will take a commandment or even a phrase in a text, and they will explore it and discuss it and try and figure it out from different angles. There's a concept called chavora, which I've read to mean a companion, and the connotation is that you're not supposed to study, or you should not. You're encouraged not to study alone. I study alone, of course. Then again, I also studied Kabbalah before I was 40, so that's another thing. But anyway, now I'm past 40, so it doesn't mean anything anymore. The Jew will discuss, and the point is to understand that text. The more you understand the text or a mitzvah, the more you understand God. It's like I don't want to put it into a hierarchical analogy, but it's like I'll remove that whole thing, parent and child analogy. I'll remove that. I'll simply say, what if you met a friend and the friend wanted you to do something? You take on a certain responsibility to help the friend out. By doing so, you understand more about the friend himself or herself. That's the concept. You understand somebody much more deeply. There's more of a bond built with that person or entity. And that's the concept, as I understand it, of tzava, and mitzvah is the variation of the root word tzava. To pronounce it correctly, it's TZ. That's a letter in the Hebrew alphabet all by itself. CZVH, tzava. And mitzvah is roughly translated as, it's more like a binding, a point of binding. It's a command. So bar means son and bat means daughter. Bar mitzvah means you go through a ceremony, and you are now the son of commandments, meaning that you are a son of the commandments. The Israelites were given these commandments to uphold, and now you have reached the point, you are now a son that has reached the point by being 13 years old and a day in the male case, and in the female case, 12 years and 1 day. You are now included, you've been included into the group, and you too have responsibility. I once talked with my rabbi. I mentioned it's more like adult in training, and he said he liked that kind of phrase. But really, you're considered an adult, and you're considered part of the group. It's like you. It's almost like I want to say Sweet 16. It's like a coming out. You now are recognized as one of the other. One of you. I'm now a part of you. And ceremony itself is simply being in the weekly, the Shabbat service, Friday night, Saturday morning. However, you conduct, in my case, part of the service, and the rabbi, the actual rabbi, does the rest of the service. I guess it could depend on how much they're willing to let the young child run the service. But the service is pretty formulaic. There's a standard. It's a regular religious group. It's a regular religious, straightforward. It's a religious service done every week. They read from the Torah. They read a certain portion from the Torah, and it's the 5 books of Moses are split. It's not necessarily book by. I mean, it goes in such a way that it transitions from the first book to the second book to the third book to the fourth book. But the way it's read in weekly portions, it goes sequentially, and the I'll say chapter markers, the portion divisions go in order. They're read weekly in order every week, but they don't recognize. There's not a, to my knowledge, there's not a huge shift between, when they transition from the last weekly portion of one book to the first weekly portion of the next book. It simply continues. I may be wrong in that. There may be some ceremony. I know there is a ceremony when they reach the final week's portion in Deuteronomy at the very end, because traditionally you read that final portion, and then there's a parading around the congregation. It's a big, it's a parade. I was about to say a big celebration. There is a parade around the Torah, the 5 books of Moses. When you read the final portion and then you read the first portion all over again. So it's intentionally circular. Read the final portion, then you go all the way back and you read the first portion again. And so the rabbi gives a sermon or commentary on that weekly portion. And all right, so I learned that, going back to myself, I learned that I was Jewish. I had to go to Sunday school, and in addition to Sunday school, I also had to take an extra class, and that was divided up into 2 segments. I first had to be tutored by, one-on-one. There was a tutor, an adult tutor, who tutored me on how to read Hebrew, and then after some weeks or months, they deemed me adequately capable of reading Hebrew. I'll tell you about that in a moment. Then I was tutored by somebody else, by the cantor, at her home, and she taught me how to read that weekly portion. They knew which portion I would be reading long, ahead of time, because they knew when my birthday fell and when I would be of adequate age to be able to do the bar mitzvah. So they knew which portion it was, because they knew when the date was. And that was the weekly portion. So my weekly portion was Chaya Sarah, which literally means life. It means life of Sarah. And ironically, that portion that's nicknamed the life of Sarah starts with Sarah's death. Sarah dies and her age was such and such, and then she gets a burial, which is weird. All right, so I had to learn how to not only read the Torah scroll. You open up the Torah scroll during the service. You had to learn how to read the Torah. You don't actually touch the Torah scroll. You take what's called a yod. Yod can either mean finger or hand. I think usually it's referred to as, term the finger. So you're giving the finger. The finger, and it's a pointer. I remember ours was a silver long rod with an actual hand with a pointing. It was like this. It was a rod with a kind of sculpted hand with a finger pointing out, which is kind of nice. And I would take it, so I'm not touching this scroll, because these scrolls are like a couple hundred years ago. They're ancient, and they're treated very carefully. And there are also stipulations. Now, I should mention the whole thing about the Talmud. especially between Christians and Jews. It's unfortunately, I think it's been intentionally misunderstood, and intentionally rumors had been spread centuries ago, and Jews were hurt quite a bit from it. This misunderstanding. Above all else, here's the Jewish concept. We were given this Torah, and it says, in fact, at one point, it says literally, it quotes God as saying in the text, "Behold, I give you this Torah," meaning not only these 5 books of Moses, but this Torah. Now, Torah, there's been speculation about what Torah actually means. From what I've read, it's an archery term, or an archery term. It's something that's been projected and moves along. So the concept is that it is passed down, or moves, moves through the air, or goes. It has been sent on a course. Torah not only refers to these commandments given, and not only commandments, but allegory and so forth, given in these 5 books of Moses, but it refers to the customs that go way, way back. Judaism prides itself on the fact that our traditions and culture and so forth go way, 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 way back. I think every culture probably prides. Well, the United States is very young, but China, I can imagine, probably feel like that, and Egypt probably feels like that. That they have a pride that their culture and their ways and so forth the traditions go all the way back. Same way with Judaism. So it not only refers to those commandments and the commentary, the stories. They're kinds of 2 sides of the same coin. Not only refers to the 5 books of Moses, which tends to be called the Torah, but it also refers to the traditions and so forth. So the quote is supposedly from, in the text, it has God saying, "Behold, my Torah, do not forsake it, don't abandon it." So, where was I going with that? So anyway, so Jews regard the Torah itself, those 5 books of Moses, very highly. It's something like the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, in that you can have other laws and so forth, but the supreme law would be the U.S. Constitution. And if there's a dispute or something, you should be biased towards upholding what it says in the Constitution. The same way in Judaism, you have the 5 books of Moses, and you have these other traditions, but the supreme say-so is the 5 books of Moses. And then I suppose you have other traditions. I was about to say, in some sense, the other commandments should jibe with the 5 books of Moses, or at least they spring out. They're talking about the same. There should be consistency. All right. So the Talmud, the Sanhedrin. This is going back about 2,000 years. So about the time of Christianity. I don't want to say about the time of Christianity beginning, but I'll just say year 0 or year 1. Around that time, maybe a couple centuries before that, around that time, you had you had the Sanhedrin. I was about to say it's like the Supreme Court. I don't know enough about the Sanhedrin to understand it well enough to say that, but it was the authority, I guess. It was part of the governing body at the time. I'll just say that. And there was a presiding officer, Hanasi. I don't know how you translate. I guess it would be pronounced president, the presiding chief of the Sanhedrin was the Nasi, Nasi, and that at the time it was Judah. And about that time, there were, I think, he's the one credited with this, because it can be confusing, because you have mythology and history intertwining. And the reason I'm pausing is that trying to differentiate mythology from history. As I understand it, the way it's told is that Judah, for whatever reason, maybe there are several Jews dying or to preserve the knowledge, constructed 6 groups of Torah, 6 groups of commandments to follow. And this is after we already have the commandments, the 5 books of Moses, the commandments in the 5 books of Moses. In addition to that, because traditionally the commandments were given to Moses, and that's there was never really a date, a year for that. The connection with the Exodus to the Pharaoh Ramses II is something that was done much later, and it's based on just guesswork. The text itself never mentions. Well, it mentions a Pharaoh's name in the 5 books of Moses, and then later on it mentions at least one other Pharaoh. No, it wasn't in the 5 books of Moses. It was later. It was during King Solomon's reign, and it mentions Shishak, the Pharaoh Shishak. Shashak in Hebrew means assaulter or attacker, and I believe this is a play on words. There is somebody by the name of an Egyptologist by the name of David Rohl, who came up with his own chronology for Egypt outside of what the Bible had, because when they knew the Bible, there were budding Egypt when there wasn't even any Egyptology to begin with. There were archaeologists who went into Egypt, and Napoleon had just entered in and conquered Egypt and obtained it, and in addition to whatever other mayhem or whatever, in addition to whatever else he did, one of his generals, one of his crew members started copying all these hieroglyphics, and they didn't know how to translate them. They just copied them, and one of them, and I'm blanking on, I want to say Ptolemy, but that's totally different. One of these French people with Napoleon started to figure out how to read hieroglyphics. You may have heard of the Rosetta Stone. The Rosetta Stone is an actual stone. I believe it was a treaty amongst or between 2 kings. I think one of them was the Egyptian king. It may have been Ramses, the Egyptian, and it may have been a Greek. There's some other nation. There's a treaty there, and when they found that, he was able to find one of the names was circled, and in Egyptian tradition, when you give the name, you put it around. You put what's called a cartouche. I guess it's like a cartridge or a cartouche. You put a circle around the name, and so he knew how to read. I think it was Greek. So there were 3 languages in this treaty or agreement. The Rosetta Stone. There was, I think it's Greek. He knew how to read Greek, and there were 2 other languages. There was ancient Egyptian, which is all hieroglyphs, and then there was like a quick form of Egyptian writing, which is hieratic, which is it's basically squiggles. So you have the hieroglyphics, which are actual symbols, like you'd see like a bird, a mouth, a cup, water, 3 snakes. You get that. And then in another portion, there were squiggle lines, and then in another portion there was Greek. I'm pretty sure it was Greek. He could read the Greek, and then he tackled these ones, and that circled name, he could make out there were symbols within the name, and then it may have even been circled in the Greek. So he started tackling that. It must have been a long journey for him trying to figure it out, but over time he started figuring out, and of course, I wouldn't be surprised if he made mistakes and errors along the way, but over time, and this is not that long ago, this is Napoleon, so this has been 1800s, early 1800s, so all of a sudden, our knowledge of Egypt expanded beyond what little we caught in the Jewish Bible, Jewish/Christian Bible. Suddenly, all these different hieroglyphs started speaking to us and giving us names, and so forth. Also, I should also add, we not only knew something about, the Bible wasn't our only source for Egyptian history. We also had historians who would quote from, I don't want to venture too far off on that. I want to go back to Judaism, but we also had ancient historians who would refer to things, historical events in Egypt, and many times they were quoting from earlier sources who were quoting from earlier sources. So it could become like a game of telephone where somebody mistranslates something or somebody characterizes something incorrectly, and then that gets passed on, and then somebody else comments on what that person, you get the idea. So here it was more like getting it from the original source. We could actually read these hieroglyphics, and there would be monuments and mummies wrapped with inscriptions and so forth. So that was exciting. Where was I going with that? Wow. I don't know. Okay, I can't remember how I got off onto that tangent, but I was talking about the Sanhedrin and the president of the Sanhedrin, Judah, creating 6 different groups of commandments, and he wanted to, for whatever reason, he wanted to preserve them, these traditions. And from what I remember, there was another such collection of commandments or traditions given. I don't think that survived. If I remember correctly, it's called the Baraita, and the Talmud the ultimate version of what I'm talking about, comments on what is also in the Baraita. I thought I'd mention that just to be complete. So he writes them in 6 different groups, and one group is women. It's interesting that women actually, for those feminists watching, it's interesting that women have their own whole group of commandments. I don't want to say they have their own writings and so forth. All devoted to women. Okay, then there's also seed, which refers to agricultural stuff. Damages, which I wouldn't be surprised is one of the more studied and well known of the 6. It refers to like personal damages, like it's basically like maybe civil, if not civil law, but like if you accidentally killed your neighbor's goat, what should happen, what's the tradition, so forth, what's fair, what's ethical, because ultimately this was some kind of systemization, gathering these laws together. I don't want to call them laws because that's what Christians call these commandments. It's traditions. It's figuring out what's the best policy. I'm going to call them policies. What's the best policy on how to handle this, and let's keep it consistent. Let's have something to refer back to, like basically public law or the public policy. Like, how do we handle this so everybody is dealt with fairly and on an equal basis? So he comes up with these 6 different groups. There's seed, women, damages, holidays, and then there's there's holy things, not just holidays, but holy things, if I remember correctly. And there's a 6th one. And then there's something I want to get to in my next video, why there are 6 and not 7 and not 4 or whatever. I'll give you a hint. It seems to be a pairing. It's 3 pairs. And that relates to how the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, are laid out. The 2 seem to have been constructed in the same way. So, as usual, remember I said Jews are nothing if not smart, creative, and curious. Well, over time, those 6 groups then get commentaries. Rabbis are very knowledgeable, and they pass on information, and then they mention. Notice here where it says such and such, and if a goat falls in a neighbor's pit, that the neighbor should pay the neighbor who owns the pit should pay his neighbor like 2/3 of the value of the goat or whatever. Well, what is the value of the goat? Well, Rabbi so and so said such and such and such and such. Rabbi such and such, another rabbi such and such said this, and there's a whole commentary, and then that's the I can't remember the Jewish term at the moment, but if I remember correctly, the original is the Gemara, and then I want to say Agadah. The other is the additional commentary put on the Gemara, as a matter of fact, and then the entire thing is nicknamed the Talmud. So those are the 6 orders of the Talmud, the 6 volumes, in some sense, like a public policy volume set. It's 6 volumes. So altogether, that's a Talmud, and at some point, it diverged. There's the Babylonian version and the Jerusalem version. It's simply because at some point, these 2 groups, these 2 different main communities, each must have started off with this main, copy, and then over time, more was added and more was added. So you have differences emerging between the 2. Not the original text, the original Gemara that Judah had written, but little things creep in. One has something that the other leaves out and stuff like that, or doesn't appear in the other for whatever reason. So altogether, it's a Talmud. So there's the misconception that had been spread by Christians way back. Some still have that the Talmud is considered more important than the Torah. It's quite the opposite. If there's a dispute, you go to the ultimate source, which would be, well, to God. But you don't know what God's desire is. That's the very point. God's desire would be expressed through the 5 books of Moses, ultimately. And then you try and go back to as earlier a source as you can get. There's some reasoning behind that. You try and go back to as close to the original source as you can get. That's where prophets come in, when you can go to the ultimate source. Anyway, so you have the Torah and so forth. So back to myself. I should mention the different denominations there are. I was brought up in the Reform movement. Now this gets into history. This is an excellent opportunity to explain some history about Israel itself. All right. you know Israel is in the Middle East. It's a very small, it's called the State of Israel, and I tend to think of it as a state. For whatever reason, it's about the shape of a U.S. state. I mean, I heard somewhere it's about the size of Georgia, maybe even smaller. It's amazing. And that's not entirely livable, residential, I don't want to say residential. It's not all of it is livable. There are areas being excavated. There are archaeological areas. There are simply areas that are very barren and can't support life. Although Israel has been clever in being able to turn soil from being arid, those areas from being arid and barren and so forth, into something life-sustaining in whatever way they found. Very clever. So you have that area, and it's surrounded by different regions. Ptolemy, I still don't, not Ptolemy, Alexander the Great, from, I think it was Macedonian, or Greek, Macedonian, doesn't get as much credit as he really deserves. This is where this is what will lead to one of the 3 books that I'm going to talk about in the forthcoming video. He goes in and he conquers, he takes over Israel, and Israel had already been through a number of conquerors and been occupied a number of times. Sometimes it's tricky. It'd be interesting to memorize the order, but there were the Persians, and then there were the before that there were a whole bunch of groups. Well, some groups that had been occupied a number of times by occupiers. So already there was a desire amongst Israelites to basically okay, here comes another oppressor who's going to occupy this land. We're under another landlord. We've got to overthrow him. And so at that point, they'd already been familiar. The 5 books of Moses had already been given to them, and they had their priests. And sometimes the occupying force would be kind and let them practice their religion. Sometimes it was to varying degrees. Sometimes they were more forceful and wouldn't let them practice their beliefs, or would prohibit certain things they had to do. And the Israelite response was, well, really, nuts to you. God gave us these commandments. God gave us these traditions and our ways. Who are you to tell us? Are you above God? Like, who are you to tell us so? So there was, so during history, in periods in history, there would be a person who would come forth and overthrow this occupying force. And there would be some sense, I guess, over time, he was anointed by God to have done, he was anointed with a special role to do this, to overthrow the occupiers. And that term is Mashiach. Mashach means anoint. So he'd be the Mashiach. In English, or it's the Greek Hellenization version of it, is Messiah. And so when a new force would come in and occupy, the Israelites would hope for some Messiah to come and lead them in battle and overthrow the forces. So, and let, kick them out of there so we can just live in peace and just let us live ourselves. Just don't bother us anymore. Just, you have your spot, and let us live the way we want to live. So, so the Greeks come in, Alexander the Great comes in, and he has a general Ptolemy and another general Seleucid, if I remember correctly. I mean, how to pronounce the name. And then there was a third general whose name I can't remember at the moment. And then he dies. If I remember correctly, he dies unexpectedly. And this is a key point. He dies without naming his successor. So already you've got somebody who, one of his generals, I think Ptolemy took over Egypt, and Seleucid took over region think it was Babylon. And then there was somebody who took over reign of Greece itself. That I think that was the third general. There were three generals. So that's Ptolemy taking over Egypt. Somebody took over Greece proper, and then somebody took over Babylon. Seleucid, the Seleucid Empire grew out of that. I think that was Babylonia. Pretty sure that was Babylonia. Check that. Please check that just to be sure. He died. Alexander dies. Ptolemy then has Ptolemy Soter the first, and then his name changes. There's a Ptolemy to Ptolemy Philadelphus, and then he, I'm treading into video 2 territory here. As I've understood it, he commissions that the 5 books of Moses be translated into Greek, and that's how you get the Septuagint, or the Septuagint. And there are differences between the Masoretic version and there are differences between the Septuagint and the Masoretic version we have now. I pause because there are slight differences in copies of text of even the Masoretic version, but the Masoretes came later, I think in the 400s, so some centuries later. There were all these different versions, and by versions, I don't mean to say that they were widely different. There were 5 books of Moses, and when a scribe copies, like with anything, when a scribe copies, despite there being stringent, and Jews have stringent traditions when it comes to copying a scroll, the lemon test, is to have an illiterate come over, somebody who doesn't read, doesn't speak, doesn't understand Hebrew at all, to look at the 2 scrolls, and if he says these match, then that's lemon test. He doesn't know, he can't read Hebrew, he can't be confused or biased or whatever, he can't overlook something. He's visually looking to see if these symbols match these symbols over here. Good idea. But certain errors creep in when scribes copy scrolls over, and that was the tradition, to copy you didn't have typewriters and so forth, so you would literally have a scribe who was knowledgeable, and there are certain patterns, and that is also something I will get into in the next video. It's a good preparation. There are certain things that a scribe, certain patterns in the text, in the 5 books of Moses text, whole text, that the scribe is trained in and is very familiar with. It's like you're watching a TV show, it's your favorite TV show, you know it by heart. You know little patterns in it, you know certain lines of dialogue, whatever. Same one with the scribe. He's copied these several times, he's trained, it's his job to know that, so many characters here, you do this. So many characters here, should be this letter. So many characters here. So many letters over, it's this marker. So over time, however, little errors creep in, and so you have little variation between one copy and another copy and another copy and another copy. So if I remember correctly, it was I want to say 444 of the Common Era, somewhere in the 400s. The Masoretes, which are simply nicknamed that because I can't remember what Masorite means, but my impression is that it's not like there's a tribe called the Masoretes. It's more like they're nicknamed that because of what they did. There were at least 2 different schools, and the Benjamin school and I can't remember what the other school is. They tried to standardize, okay, of these different variations, we're going to out of these different variations, we're going to standardize the text. We want just one text, enough with these variations. We want one text, and and you wouldn't write the vowels. You would only write the consonants. So if you look in a scroll even today, you wouldn't see the vowels. You would only see the consonants, and there are philosophical reasons for only writing the consonants. There are spiritual reasons. There are, Jewish, Israelite, religious reasons. I don't mean religious, just traditions. I mean like practically, it's Kabbalistic, but practically almost back to the giving of the Torah to Moses. There are reasons why these consonants are the only things that you're writing, and you just know how to pronounce them. You just know. I say that tongue-in-cheek because there is guesswork and people have debated. Well, if you interpret it as this vowel instead of that vowel, this word could become that word, which could have a totally different meaning. I don't know where this tradition comes or this teaching comes from, but there's one teaching that says the beginning line of Genesis was not Breshit bara et hashemayim ve'et haaretz. Breshit bara Elohim, whatever, the rest of it, which translates as when beginning Elohim created the heaven. It wasn't. There's a tradition that says it wasn't given like that, and Moses wrote it down that way. There's a tradition that it was when it was dictated, it was letter by letter, Bet, Resh, Aleph, Shin, Yud, Tav, Bet, Resh, whatever, and just in sequence, letters in sequence, a whole like 7,000 or something characters in sequence. So he's copying it. So people debate, well, if you separate this phrase over here, instead of the way we commonly divide it up into these two words, if you don't divide it here, if you have the first few letters over here and then divide it over here, it becomes a different phrase, stuff like that. Anyway, right, so as I mentioned before, the generals took over after Alexander's death, and there's a story that's actually mentioned in the Talmud. I know Christians have characterized the Talmud as some kind of evil thing, and unfortunately, in the more anti-Semitic stuff, sermons and so forth, and writings, they characterize the Talmud, all sorts of evil things that are in the Talmud. Of course, nobody actually ever goes in and actually reads the Talmud or becomes more familiar with it. No, they just follow what they've heard in their church or sermon or whatever, what they read in some anti-Semitic diatribe. No, you get, not only do you get these traditions written down and commentaries on the traditions, but in the commentaries, the rabbis talk a lot, give a lot of anecdotes about what those times were like. A measurement of we learn certain measurements. We learn anecdotes about like how the measurement system was and how, we just learn a huge amount of history from that that you wouldn't get otherwise. Sometimes that's the only reference you may have to a kingship list or whatever. I mean, I say that off the top of my head, but it's like an encyclopedia of that time and an informational, valuable resource of those times. Thank goodness. So, where was I going with that? So you get a lot of knowledge about those times. Oh, one of the stories told, I believe it's in the Talmud from one of these rabbi commentaries, is that that the Ptolemy, Philadelphus, commissioned this translation to be done into the Septuagint. I guess I won't venture yet into what I think happened or what a certain book proposes actually happened. Oh, I'll give you a hint. This author proposes persuasively that that it was that it wasn't just a translation from the Hebrew into the Greek. It was that there was a commission either set up the way the story tells it by Ptolemy, or it was a group sparked off by something, some motivation to actually write a history of the Israelites, just like a few years before, according to this book, there's a priest in Egypt that wrote a history. His name was Manetho, Manetho. He wrote it's a 3-volume history of Egypt called the Egyptiaca, and there was a priest in Babylonia who named Berosus, who wrote a history, and you guessed it, it was called Biblionaca, something like that. He wrote a history of Babylonia. So it matches up that this just seems to come out of nowhere. The 5 books of Moses seem to have just sprung up about that same time. I haven't read any reference before that, like going through history. I don't know of anything biblically related occurring or any reference to it before that time. I concur with the author. I don't see anything, and then that translation, supposed translation into the Septuagint, seems to be the first event, and then after that you get references, and then Dead Sea Scrolls come in and so forth, and you get reference, and then it's clearly existing after that point. But he suspects that it wasn't just a translation into Greek; it was a creation, and then they also, perhaps they or like, as he jokes, it's like 5 minutes later, it was translated into the Greek, into the Septuagint. It's like the two. There were like phrases. There's a very close. It seems to be a very close tie between the two. But clearly, it was written in Hebrew. The original would have been in Hebrew because of the wordplay that becomes lost. You don't get that in English translations. The Hebrew text is very interesting, and if you can be able to read Hebrew, your eyes will be opened, and you'll be able to catch wordplay. In Hebrew, in the 5 books of Moses, the actual Hebrew text, there are wordplays. There sometimes there's a certain point where it's describing the movement out of Egypt through the river and on to the rest of their journey, and literally it's written in 3 columns, as if this is the one piece, this Egypt, and then the river, and then da 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 da. Visually, it's like that, and there are word codes. It's one of my favorite points is that, and scribes know this. Even modern scribes know this. There's an equidistant letter skip pattern in the beginning lines of each of the 5 books. The first couple of books, there's 49 letter skip pattern, and 49 is very important because 7, you may know, biblically and tradition-wise, the 7th day is day of rest. The 7th year, every 7 years, the 7th year, you let the land rest, and then there's a jubilee year, 49. The 50th year. It's a question whether it's 49th year or 50th year, depending on how you do it. But it's 49 is 7 times 7. There's clearly a pattern there. So there's a 49 letter skip pattern in the first 4 of the 5 books of Moses. And now the first 2 books, and this is in the very first lines. The first two books, Genesis and Exodus, if you take the letter immediately after the 49 letters, there's that 49 letter skip pattern. You take the next letter, you skip another 49 letters, so forth. It spells out Torah, Tav, Vav, Resh, Hey. First two books. Okay, that may be something. However, in addition to that, the final two books, and of course Deuteronomy, it's a 48 letter skip pattern for whatever reason, I don't know. 48 at the in Deuteronomy, it's Torah backwards. It's Hey. Okay, Hey, Resh, Vav, Tav, Torah backwards. So you have what's called a chiastic structure, and that was a known poetic structure technique, known in Greek in Greek culture, and it's probably known, it's very clearly known in Jewish culture or Israelite culture, because there are texts, specific texts in the 5 books of Moses where there's a clear structure. It starts off with a line, even when they're telling, well, especially when they're telling a story, it's a poetic, ballad or something. It starts off, this line, first line matches the final line thematically, and then the next, it doesn't even have to be that thematic. It could be more literal, like it starts off with a line talking about how he entered the room, and then the final line talks about how he leaves the room. And then he enters the room, he picks up a glass of water, and then he drinks from it, and then usually if there's a middle line between these, depends on how they're evenly divided. If there's an extra line in the middle, that's the chiastic, that's the Greek term, chiastic X. Chiastic, the X symbol, the chi, chiastic line. And so you have, this line matches with this line. You have, he enters the room, he drinks a glass of water, he puts the glass down, he suddenly has a revelation. He picks up the glass, he drinks from the glass, and he leaves the room. So you see the first line matches the final line, second line matches the penultimate line, next line matches this line, and then there's a shift, the sudden shift. He has a revelation. So, and that would be the chiastic line. So in the 5 books of Moses, you have Torah spelled out with a 49 letter skip pattern in the first lines of each book respectively, and then Torah backwards, 49 letter skip pattern, and then 48 in the final line. And then right in the middle, there's that chiastic book, Leviticus. And that's, now the others were 49. This is a variation of 49 at the beginning of the book. That's 7 letter skip pattern, 7 letter skip pattern. You have Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey, which is the personal term for God. Now, I've skipped over this. Might as well mention it right now because it comes up very much in my second video, or it will come up. There are 2 primary terms for God. There's Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey, and there's Elohim. And up until a certain point, I'd say the 1700s, the Bible was just taken as God's word, and it was simply recognized, and people didn't question it. That's the Jewish way of doing things, and that's their sacred book, and this is taken as literal history of what happened. And then something came along which eventually became known as the documentary hypothesis. Somebody pointed out, hey, I think one of the very first things that was caught was that Moses could not have written all these books, because look here, it says, and Moses died. Wow. And then I've heard in a Torah study in our temple, there was a para-rabbi who mentioned that there's a tradition that he wrote, that Moses wrote that final line as God was dictating the 5 books of Moses to him. When he started writing down that he was going to die, and Moses died, he wept. And there's probably a story behind, an interesting, illuminating, philosophical message behind that story, as Jewish folklore and tales tend to do. That gets into another tradition of Jewish storytelling. But anyway, that's one take on it. But anyway, all right, going back to history, actual history, somebody pointed out around the 1700s, somebody pointed out, hey, wait a minute, or somewhere along the line, I know it began, this reassessment of how the Bible was written started around the 1700s. Somebody said, hey, wait a minute, how come it says Moses died? Moses could not have written at least that line. And then little by little, they started breaking down, okay, how they started questioning, did Moses really write all 5 books? And nowhere in the Torah does it actually say that Moses wrote this. It says, probably, I wouldn't, at some points it may say Moses wrote, I know for a fact it says Moses wrote these Torot, plural for Torah, meaning these commandments. But that doesn't necessarily refer to the entire Torah, the 5 books of Moses. I think it more accurately refers to these commandments, because whatever. Okay. So then that evolved into the documentary hypothesis, which simply says that, or posits that, and became very big in the 20th century. It's now it has been the academic standard up until recently. Now that's being questioned. So I'm going to, in the next video, I'm going to clue you in, and I'm going to explain, I'm going to help, with that video, I'm going to help myself by testing whether these 3 books, leading books, jibe well with each other. I think they do. They seem to. And I'm going to enlighten you on this new way of looking at the writing of the Torah. What I guess is the true evolution of the Torah, and that gets into Kabbalah, actual Kabbalah, and what Kabbalah is. All right, so let me see. Oh, so the documentary hypothesis. So they noticed that sometimes Abraham speaks to Elohim, or sometimes God is referred to as Elohim. Sometimes God, or the divine force, is labeled Yud He Vav He, and people suspected, well, there was a Yud He Vav He follower, and there was an Elohim follower, or Elohim group. These seem to be 2 different strands of Jewish or Israelite cultures that were then somehow bound, edited together. Then they also noticed, hey, some of this Elohim, some of the texts that refer to God as Elohim, this isn't, I don't think this is really accurate, but for the sake of this explanation, let me go along with me. This Elohim segment of Judaism, or Israelite, our culture, this Elohim segment seems to be focused on or concerned with priestly things. So maybe there was a priestly writer, in addition to an Elohist writer, and then over here the Yud He Vav He, one of the names. So I'm going to explain what Yud He Vav He means. Remember I said before the consonants are the only things written. So in the text it gives, for this name, it gives the 4 letters Yud He. Here, let me do this. I don't know how it comes left or right, but it looks like an apostrophe. Yud He Vav He. And the explanation for that name comes up a lot in Kabbalah. What is Kabbalah? Dispensing with any jokes or whatever. All right, humor. All right. There are different traditions that are simply given. and Jews being who they are and the stereotype of a Jew, he or she questions and is curious. Well, why is it that way? Explain to me this. What's the nature of God? How did the universe begin? How did God create the atom? How did whatever, blah, 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 blah. So going way, way, way back, and there's a real question as to how far it goes back. I won't go into what authors' opinions are. I'll simply say that traditionally it's taught that Abraham wrote a text that's mystical, that we have the text now, but it's attributed to the biblical character of Abraham. There's another text that's attributed to being written by Adam, and we have other texts that are mystical, and they don't compare exactly. There's not a formula on how to write a Kabbalistic text. The Kabbalistic texts, what do they have in common? Well, they're written in Hebrew, and they have some more so than others. They seem to only give as much information, as they're very poetic in certain ways. Structurally they're very poetic. Different kinds of poetry. They seem to only give as much information as needed, and they don't waste words. You get a sense of what it's saying, but it doesn't hit you over the head. It doesn't go on and on and on and on, practically boring you. You get a glimpse. It's almost like looking at the universe. Like you get a quick glimpse or a glimmer or something. Wow! Oh yeah, I think I know what he's trying to talk. I think I know what this is trying to explain. So forth. You get some imagery. That's what's common amongst this corpus of Kabbalistic texts. But other than that, they're structured very differently. The earliest that we, in terms of dating these, when they were actually written, if you don't go along with the tradition that they were written way, way back by Adam and Abraham and so forth, you go along with modern scholars trying to figure out when they were written. The earliest that we have is probably the Sefer Yetzirah, and that's also the shortest one. Now, the third book that I'll get into in my forthcoming video is about Stan Tenen's research and tying Kabbalah in with basic Jewish concepts and traditions. It's fascinating. And he's deceased, but he wrote a book called, with his wife, wrote a book called The Alphabet That Changed the World. And there are a lot of pictures in there, a lot of diagrams. So, and it needs to have a lot of diagrams, because this isn't just stuff in your head and waxing philosophically, and it's not just taking a toke of something and going, ooh, I wonder what God is like. No. Very concise, specific diagrams and mathematics and geometry, sacred geometry, but actual geometry, but what's also been affectionately known as sacred geometry. So there's a question, really. There's no delineation mark. This is when Kabbalah begins. It's these texts have always been there. So these are the teachings. And I said before, I joked that I started studying Kabbalah on my own before I was 40 years of age. That comes about because of a warning, I believe, by a convert to Judaism, actually. I think he was lived about 2,000 years ago, if I remember correctly. And if I remember correctly, he wrote a letter warning. As with anything, you can see in modern times, Kabbalah had become trendy, and people who were not Jews, for example, would just go to this rabbi who won't mention any names, but say hypothetically a rabbi or somebody who just is into esoteric stuff, just starts a school and just teaches people, and there's some greed that kicks in, and he teaches the more prosperous, wealthy people and gets a lot of money from it, and he teaches some aspects of Kabbalah. The student may be very earnest and wanting, very, very genuinely curious about understanding Kabbalah, is not necessarily Jewish, doesn't have any Jewish background, doesn't read Hebrew at all. Can you imagine how confusing it would be, and how many misinterpretations the student can get and acquire from what the teacher teaches? Now, there's some principle in Judaism in that, remember I said before, you need to have, when any Jew studies a text, it's good to have a chavora. You have study companions, and the two discuss some text. Well, in a rabbi-student relationship, traditionally, there's a recognized relationship, a bond that develops. The two good examples that come to my mind are typically the relationship in Star Wars between Luke Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi, Ben Kenobi, and then also between Luke Skywalker and Yoda. There's not only a teaching of knowledge, but there's a friendship and an actual, genuine, more like three-dimensional relationship that develops between the two. There's a connection that forms. It's not just dispensing of information. And the other movie is The Karate Kid, the sensei. There's a relationship that forms between Daniel and Mr. Miyagi. So the same thing has traditionally been. Now, of course, modern times, you have a huge congregation, lots and lots of families, and the rabbi is very busy and so forth. But in older times, like, if you go to Middle Ages and so forth, and 18th century, this is the concept, the Jewish concept, that you have almost a one-on-one, or basically, if you can, you have a one-on-one relationship. The rabbi teaches the student, the Jewish student. And Kabbalah was very involved in this. Kabbalah is kind of a part and parcel. And that's how, so basically Judaism is not just the 5 books of Moses. I think that's a big difference my impression is that's a big difference between Judaism and Christianity. I don't know about Islam. My guess is Islam is closer to Judaism in the sense that there are lots of different texts, and it's not just the 5 books and, I hold my holy Bible sacred and so forth. There's the Talmud. There's of course, as I said before, don't mistake that the Talmud is held higher than the 5 books of Moses, but there's the Talmud, there's the 5 books of Moses, and also actually the rest of the Torah, the rest of the Tanakh, the Jewish Bible. There are the Kabbalistic texts, and probably other things I'm just simply not remembering at the moment. So all that together entails the Jewish knowledge, sense of Jewish knowledge altogether. So that letter, I think it was a letter that this Jewish convert about 2,000 years ago wrote, if I remember correctly, accurately. He warned, if you have someone studying before the age of 40, and 40 is a symbolic number, being roughly a generation. Like when you reach the age of 40, especially in those times, 2,000 years ago, you will have lived you experienced a very thorough life. You will have probably married by that point. You'd probably have a child. You would, one thing I can't hide away from this, sex, you have experienced sex. and you have experienced hardship, and you've experienced disagreements with neighbors, and you've had to take on the mantle of adulthood and so forth. You get the idea. So so at there's a warning: don't teach Kabbalah, don't study Kabbalah really before the age of 40 because you're unprepared. It's not like we will put you in prison or something. It's more like I haven't read the actual letter, but I know the gist of it. You won't be able to understand it, and not only that, the danger being that you not only not understand it, but you may misunderstand it, and then you'll spread it around, and then we'll have misunderstandings about what the actual teaching means. And it becomes very difficult to undo that when you actually go and understand the true teaching, because we all, Jews and I think people in general, want to basically get it from the horse's mouth, or understand, tell me what it actually is. I don't want to get misunderstandings. I don't want to be led astray. I want to understand what it's like. It's, in some sense, it's like science in that, very much like science in this respect. The student wants to learn actual physics, doesn't want to learn metaphysics. He doesn't want to learn how magic gets into it. He wants to learn actual physics. So in this way, you want to learn actual Kabbalah. You don't want to be swayed or whatever. So that by age 40, you would have had a life experience, and these teachings are more than just pure information. They relate to life. It's very philosophical. Judaism relates very much philosophically to life, and having how to have a better life and an optimistic life. And it has an optimistic view of life in general. I think a decent, healthy life. And I feel very glad and I feel very proud to have been brought up. I was born, my mom was Jewish, and her parents were Jewish, and so forth. And it's very family tree oriented. That doesn't mean that you can convert, you can't convert to Judaism, but I feel very proud that, within the bloodline, there's a Jewish background. My mother was Jewish, her parents were Jewish, her parents' parents were Jewish, and so forth, going all the way back. So anyway, back to Kabbalah and teaching, and so it relates to philosophy. It relates on lots of different ways that I know when I turn off this video, I'll be sad if I haven't expressed this. I feel as if I ought to have an awkward time communicating this with non-Jews, because it's so different from Christianity. And like I said at the beginning of this video, or implied or whatever, there's a disconnect, and I feel sometimes it's awkward. I don't know. I can try. I'm gifted in language, as you may have picked up, in terms of explaining things, explaining concepts. But I want to, because it's so rich, it's so vibrant, it's not just vibrant, it's not just pride speaking. There's a whole thing behind it. It's substantial. Like this, it's substantial. A non-Jew may have a tough time. At the very least, it's unfamiliar to a non-Jew. It could be understood, it could be explained, and over time, of course, depending on how open the person is to new ideas, that could help. The person may pick up and understand it. Okay, going back to the letter and so forth. The age of 40, he recommended, beginning then, person will have accumulated enough life experience to understand how Kabbalah relates to actual life out in the world. there's a precaution in Judaism not to let yourself become too overwhelmed by simply studying Torah. You have to, and don't just say Kabbalah, but Torah in general. You have to incorporate it into the outside world. The two go hand in hand. Don't lock yourself in a library and simply study all the time. And then at the same time, don't go outside in the daily world and spend all of your time in the daily world. You have to study Kabbalah and study Torah and so forth, so that the two mesh together. And hopefully it will be transparent. You will be mentally transparent in the sense that these two will nicely weave together and one won't be overshadowing the other. My throat is feeling sore. I've done 2 videos. This is now an hour and 25 minutes. Holy cow. Holy cow, I say that in a video like this. Wow. I started off, I somewhere in the video here, I mentioned that I grew up in a Reform denomination, and then I took a severe left turn and so forth. All right, so so my mom told me that I'm Jewish, and I studied with the cantor on how to chant the lines in the Torah, because it's not simply just a history book or whatever. There are cantillation markers that have been assigned to it. It's not in a regular page of Torah. If you get a page, it's not in the scrolls themselves that you unravel, but in a standard book, you'd have the vowels written in below the consonants. You would also sometimes see the cantillation marks that indicate how to sing or chant the verses. I bet that's something that you probably didn't know before. Yes, there is actually a way to chant these verses. And it could change depending on what season you're chanting them in, what season, like winter or fall or whatever. So I've been told. Anyway, so I went through the cantor training, cantorial training, and then when it came time, I didn't know what I was reading. I was so nervous and so forth. Me being 13 years and something, I just took the marker and I simply recited the chanted verses as I had memorized them. It was a song. That got me through. And then later on, of course, I studied, okay, what is the point? What is the point? So that was in 8th grade. And after 8th grade, I finished middle school, and then I entered high school. It's 9th through 12th grade. And during high school, I became more proud of my Jewish heritage. I've written about that in my memoirs that I have up on Amazon for sale. Anyway, so I grew up in a Reform movement. Going back to that question about the evolution of the Israelites and Israelite history, as I understand it, it's foggy. There are references to the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Essenes, and it becomes clouded. The Essenes have been connected with the Dead Sea Scrolls. We don't know that for sure. All that we know is that there were several caves, about 11 caves I remember, and maybe some found after that. There were different scrolls hidden away, and my guess is that this was because of the Roman occupation, and they had to hide the scrolls. You can read into the, they had to hide this stuff to preserve it in case anybody decided, oh, we wouldn't like that you have that in your possession, we're going to burn it. So that's my guess, and it seems to be a pretty good guess. Other people would agree. The Sadducees, we see these two terms, Sadducees and Pharisees. there has been a guess. Now those two terms appear in the Christian Bible, and of course the Christian Bible, the King James Bible and so forth. Believe it or not, that's a translation from the Greek Christian Bible. It was Greek, and then there were English translations. Some even before the King James version. But anyway, the Sadducees, Greek Hellenization of an Israelite term, and Pharisees, again, it's a transliteration, it's a variation on the original Hebrew term. Now, what were the original Hebrew terms? Guesses are Sadducees were originally Tzadokim, and Pharisees were originally Perushim. Perushim, as I understand, if I remember correctly, means the pure ones, and the Tzadokim, researchers have guessed that the Tzadokim, or it seems clear apparently, unless I read otherwise, the Tzadokim were the ones endorsing or tied in with the temple, as it was, the second temple and so forth, that tied in. And the Perushim were the pure ones, and there were various differences in beliefs between the two. And for whatever, I won't belabor speculation because that could be wrong, but suffice it to say that something happened to the Tzadokim. The Perushim traditions lived on, and then the Essenes. Now, I believe it was Josephus that writes. Yes, it was Josephus that writes about there being several sects, and one of them was the Essenes, who lived out in the mountains or wilderness or whatever. And so, therefore, people pointed out, these Essenes must be those people that were living out in the wilderness and hid the scrolls in the caves, right? The Dead Sea Scrolls in the caves. Don't be so quick on that. We don't know who wrote. We know that a community wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, or at least there was a community that wrote some scrolls and hid them in some of the caves. Could have been more than one group whose texts were hidden in the caves. We don't know. It's just, Josephus says the Essenes were in that area, so therefore they are equated with the ones that wrote the scroll. That's changing, and that's being revised. So those three sects, to my knowledge, no longer exist. And you have, I guess, the Perushim continued on, and then you have, that would be some centuries before the year 1 of the modern calendar, and then, as I said before, around the year, a couple hundred years before the modern calendar begins, you have Judah, who puts together the Gemara, and then there's commentary added onto that, and that forms the Talmud. And sometimes, there's this essentially group of there's this Jewish culture that thrives and continues living, and there's a diaspora. They spread around to the rest of the world, and so to sum it up, or to shorten it, I remember in Germany in the 1800s, and I guess elsewhere, the Reform movement sprang up in Germany in the 1800s. There was a movement towards modernizing, and of course science creeps in, and we think we know more modern things now than we did back then, and there was a movement towards living in a more modern world, and that entails possibly giving up some traditions or questioning certain traditions, so forth. So they modernized and acclimated more, and then over time, less Hebrew was being, I imagine their sermons would entail less Hebrew, and because all the whole Torah and all the stuff is written in Hebrew, so I would imagine it makes sense. I would imagine less Hebrew was being spoken, and they, from what somebody told me, the service, the Reformed service, was based on, or an adaptation. It was influenced. It was kind of borrowing from one of the Christian, I think, one of the Protestant, I'm sure, one of the Protestant movements, and I can't remember which one. May have been Lutheran or Baptist or whatever. Can't remember which denomination, but you could see there's an effort to appear like the rest of you all. And so, as usually happens, there was a backlash. Others said, no, we don't want to give up these traditions. They're very important. They're very rich. And so you have a split. You have the moderns and the traditionalists, basically. And then they became the Reform and Orthodox, basically. And then the Reform movement, then there are other denominations that sprang up too. I believe it's in the 20th century. There's I want to say compromise. There's like a kind of in the middle group that seems to hold closer toward Orthodox, but modernized a bit. That's the conservative movement. And then something really weird. I've heard of the conservative dox movement, which I guess is something like between conservative and Orthodox. I don't know how exactly you get that. And then there's a Reconstructionist movement. I don't remember when that sprang up, but that is basically a movement. This shows you how widespread and how wide open Jewish thought is. There was a Reconstructionist movement that sprang up that about sometime, I think I'm pretty sure in the 20th century, mid 20th century or sometime around there. That said, okay, we have this cultural heritage, we have these values. They don't necessarily come from a deity, but we have these cultural values. We value them greatly, and we will uphold our identity as Jews. That's the Reconstructionist movement. It's sort of the humanist movement in Judaism. So there's a Reform all the way at one end, there's the Orthodox, and then people say ultra-Orthodox, which is really a way of saying, well, they're Orthodox, and then they're different splinter, families or subsects that have, they wear their clothing in a certain way, or they have certain traditions. I guess it's kind of like if you were Orthodox or traditionalist, and you grew up from a Russian, like a Soviet, like Eastern European background, your flavor of orthodoxy would also include these extra traditions from your Eastern European background. So that would be kind of a certain sect within Orthodox. And then you have this group that sprang up following, certain rabbis' traditions. So it's flavored a certain way, but they're all really Orthodox. So that's kind of where you get ultra-Orthodox and certain splinters within Orthodox. So I don't think really there are as many sects within Judaism as there are in Christianity. And there are different reasons for, I think there are different reasons for these sects developing, these movements developing in Judaism, which I think are different from the motivations that were involved in Christianity. That's only my take on it. So I grew up in the Reform movement. My parents were Reformed, and I think their parents were Reformed. The Reform movement is moving closer towards traditional lifestyle. And I do say lifestyle. It's not just something, Judaism is not something you go to Sunday, Saturday evening or Saturday morning or Friday evening or something, and you just say those things, and the rest of the week it's nothing. It's very different from that. It's a whole lifestyle. It's very family related, very family oriented, and it involves your whole life. and that's where these sects come in. Depending on how willing you are to adhere to traditions, is where you would fall within these movements. And if you're orthodox, the more orthodox you are, the more limited, I'll go out on a limb and say, the more limited you are in terms of contact with the rest of the world, the non-Jewish world, I'll say. The more strict your observance would be to the commandments. That would mean not only, like, where's the Reform movement, like, for example, in terms of dietary laws and what you eat and what you don't eat, you restrict yourself from eating. And these laws, these commandments are given in Leviticus and so forth. It's not just extra tradition. The idea about not eating ham or bacon or certain foods, those are given right in the 5 books. As somebody in the Reform movement, you simply don't eat those foods like I do. I simply don't eat those foods. There's more tradition that says you don't even go into a restaurant where those foods are served, lest there may be some contamination or something, like physical, actual chemical, like contamination from one to the other. And then that gets into having separate plates, some set of plates and silverware and so forth reserved for like meat and another for dairy, lest you break one of those commandments and have them cross-contaminating and so forth. And it's also spiritually, your mindset is different when you're using certain dishes and silverware for the Sabbath as opposed to weekly dishes, and you probably get the idea. So it depends on how strictly you observe these commandments and their different interpretations and so forth. So I grew up in Reform, which is more lenient and more worldly, and I imagine the more very the quite more orthodox groups would say would perhaps liken me more to the outside world. On some level, they would regard me, they would still recognize me as Jewish. In some basis, even the ultra-Orthodox, I won't say all of them, all of us, but even the Orthodox, on some level, regards everybody, all the denominations as Jewish, and there's some recognition and appraise, and there's some pride and some sense of kinship. But on a certain level, when it comes to commandments, I'd say that's where you draw the line. In terms of how you characterize this, so for example, this group of Jews, if they're less adherent to the commandments, if you're from an orthodox, very orthodox upbringing, you would regard these Jews who are, for example, in Reform movement or Reconstructionist as not, I would say, probably put words in their mouths, but I would think they would say these Jews aren't adhering to the commandments enough. It's not that they're not Jews or they're wrong Jews or whatever. They're not adhering to the commandments enough, and perhaps at some point they will become more adherent. Maybe they will realize and value their Jewish heritage enough to become more strict in their observance. I'm guessing that's how the more Orthodox would view the more Reform or liberal movements. So, all right, I've talked quite a bit, and I think we're ready for the second video. I reached forward just to maneuver. I've moved this camera where I see myself. I moved it over to the side so it's less distracting. So what am I going to cover in the next video, or the part 2 of this video? I'm going to cover the works of 3 primary books, and that's not to say I just latched onto these 3 books and so forth. This I'm using these three books as my primary sources because they jibe with all the other stuff in terms of Judaism and the Bible and Kabbalah that I've accumulated mentally up here. Yes, it's not, there's no leakage coming out somewhere. Yes, I've accumulated up here over my decades of life and study. When did I begin studying the Bible earnestly, seriously? It was probably around, that's something I should cover actually. I leapt into this one. No, I'll be brief. So I had my bar mitzvah around in 8th grade, and then in high school, I had a sense of pride. One of my favorite TV shows is Star Trek, and one of the characters is Spock, and his mother was an Earth woman, and his father is a Vulcan, and he identifies as a Vulcan, lives a Vulcan lifestyle, and so he's torn. The Vulcans have emotions, but they're much, much older as a civilization than Earthlings, and they were much more violent than humans are. Which, you know, this is fictional, but if it weren't fictional, maybe you could get a sense of maybe this could comfort you as a human, and thinking that boy, this other race was much more violent than us. You think we're not so bad after all, perhaps. So anyway, the Vulcans were a very violent race, and then Surak was one of those leaders. Like this is me filling it in, but likening it to Dr. Martin Luther King and those people who had a tough time trying to start civil rights movements and so forth, and social movements. Surak was one of those people in Vulcan history that said, let's not kill each other. Let's go towards reason and logic and dialogue and reasoning things out. So then over time, more of them, more social more social activists came, and then they did away with emotions in general. Instinctively, biologically, and of course it's all fictional, but they are still born with an emotional instinct. That's something interesting, just as perhaps like a college, like a term paper or an essay. At what point does evolution and Darwinism enter into this? Because the way it's explained in Star Trek, the way it's taken in Star Trek, is that Vulcans have an emotional instinct. They've learned to suppress it through social this is social conditioning, entering it in. Sometimes it's helpful. Just social pressure saying, no, it's in bad taste to react emotionally. Think logically, think rationally. And it pulled them back, and then they became very smart, and or whatever. They became regarded as very smart and intellectual. So Spock is caught between his emotional side and his rational side, and I think that's in us all. There's a struggle. I tend to go along my rational side anyway. I think I have a healthy balance between my rational and my emotional sides, but I tend to there's a good term for it. I tend to train my emotional sides not to go overboard. I'll put it that way. So in high school, I prided my Jewish heritage, and the same way I felt a kinship with Spock, priding his Vulcan heritage, and it felt like I was amongst, as he is amongst humans, I was amongst non-Jews, and it's just a very non-Jewish world. I wish things were different. I try to, I go to temple and so forth. I associate with Jews, and I feel a sense of Jewish kinship. It's just that the percentages are not in my favor. Like they're around me. They're just non-Jews. I mean, they're friendly and so forth. It's like they're no paisanos. They're like Italian would probably pick up on what I mean by that. Like there's hardly any of my kin around me, especially in school. So, and in Star Trek, each iteration of Star Trek, there's been this orphan character. In the original series, it was Spock. In the Next Generation, well, actually, there's more than one. Data was like an orphan character. He was an android, and there were no other androids but him. He was working amongst, well, largely humans, for the most part humans. And Worf was another character who was Klingon, and they had just made a peace treaty with the Federation. So they hadn't joined the Federation, they just made an alliance with the Federation, and he's the only, he says in one episode in season 1, he's the only Klingon that he knows of in Starfleet. So they've dwelt on that. They've explored that, and they've explored that a little bit. His feelings of being alone, and I'm the only one, in Starfleet. And then he'll exaggerate his, or rely. He'll demonstrate his Klingon nature, and it's very different for a Klingon. And Klingons don't think this way. And I'm eating this Klingon food, which is different than human food, and so forth. And that's in the Next Generation. And then Deep Space Nine, there's Odo, who is he doesn't even know where he came from. He's just different. He's a shapeshifter. Literally, he's a being of material that can change, that can form in different shapes. And because CGI was just coming in at that point, 1993, and so he doesn't know where he came from. He doesn't know his origins, and he's alone. And he's an orphan. There seems to be an orphan character. I think in Enterprise, T'Pol is a Vulcan again, and she's having to serve amongst humans. So there's been this orphan character in each iteration of Star Trek. So I felt that way. So going back to my Jewish heritage, so I go off to college, and I start wanting to find, I start wanting to date, and I want to find a Jewish woman, and I just want to date, but I don't want to waste a woman's time. I want to find, if I'm going to start dating, I want to find someone Jewish. And it was difficult because I commuted to college campus, and I lived at home with my mom. But anyway, okay, that's detracting. So I saw this documentary about halfway in 1996 or 95 or whatever. I saw this 3-part documentary by David Rohl, where he was an Egyptologist, and he was reassessing the chronology that had been built up using the biblical timeline. And it's a fascinating documentary. It was based on a book he had written called, it goes by 2 titles. It goes by, because he's British, and of course it goes by one title in Great Britain, and it goes by another title in the United States when it's exported. Yes, it's called Pharaohs and Kings. The original title is Pharaohs and Kings in Great Britain, and it was exported, and the title is A Test of Time. Either way, I could see both titles being applicable. So I believe the documentary is called Pharaohs and Kings, and it has been released officially on DVD. So anyway, at that point, that's when my mom got me a good, reliable Bible, Jewish Bible, that has a pretty good English translation. It's not the King James. It was taken from earlier English translations. However, it didn't use Moses. It would transliterate the Hebrew names. That's good. And it also had the Hebrew on the other side for each page. So it had has the actual Hebrew. I still have it with the vowels and the cantillation marks. I treasure that, and that got me curious and more fascinated by how the Bible was put together, and set me off on this journey. And then about that point, I was studying a little bit of Kabbalah and a little bit more. I don't remember exactly. Around towards the end of 2000, I was reading more of the actual text of Kabbalah. I probably started just with online, going online, like they say Google search, I see keyword search about concepts in Kabbalah, and I began studying the tree of life diagram. And remember, because 1998, I had written the screenplay Manhattan Masquerade, which had Jake, that screwball comedy where Jake Ropespeeder bumps into Madonna, and it's a comedy farce, and there's a plot behind that. There were some Kabbalistic concepts in that, and then it's like a parallel evolution. As I was continuing to work and redraft that screenplay, I was also studying Kabbalah. So I noticed easy connections I could add from Kabbalah into Kabbalistic concepts into the Madonna screenplay. And so, and it seemed to be a more interesting and enriching story as I found Kabbalistic concepts that seemed to fit together, and they weren't just random Kabbalistic teachings and concepts I just threw in there. I had a concept behind the screenplay that there's more to the universe than you see with your own eyes, and that thematically works into Jake, who then whose name was changed to Joe after Joseph in the Bible, and because of Joseph and Pharaoh, I was likening to Madonna and Joe. That there's more to Madonna than her public persona. She has a private life in her own. She's an actual person, and Joe struggles and starts learning that she is an actual person. And the same way she starts learning that he is an actual person, doesn't rely on just superficial judgments, snap judgments about him, assessing him. And that was part of this relationship through line I had all the way back from the initial inspiration of the story. The objective story may have changed, but there was that was the initial gist I had. Like, what if I met Madonna? How would she regard me? How would she be different than the assumptions I made about her and the presumption about what she's like just based on superficial media? What would she be like as a person? That's been the gist. So Kabbalah has lots of concepts that relate to that. And so as I was studying Kabbalah, I was inserting and incorporating those elements into the screenplay. So I'd say, and now that was 1998, and then I'd say early 2000s was when I was studying Kabbalah more, and alongside, of course, I'm studying the Bible more and more on my own, and I'm picking up these things like the equidistant letter sequencing, and there was a popular book that came out, and I bought the first copy. I didn't buy the next copies. Maybe I bought the second book, but there are 3 books called the Bible Code, and that mentions the equidistant letter sequencing, but it goes off on a different route, a different interpretation of what the Bible Code should be. I think there is an actual Bible Code, and that's what I'm going to get to in this part 2 of this video. All right, so going back to the 3 sources. One is Stan Tenon's work, which has found, he presents a conceptual model of what Kabbalah was trying to explain. He presents a conceptual, all right, here it is. Here's the gist. Here's the beginning of this second video, almost. He presents a conceptual model that he believes was there from the very beginning. He believes he was there from the very beginning. I smirk and I smile because I know a nice way of tying all 3 books together. Okay, Stan Tenon developed this conceptual model that he suspects was there all the way from the beginning, and that Kabbalists, over time, as they die off, and people, later generations of Kabbalists, look at notes from earlier Kabbalists, they try and write, they write these texts trying to describe these diagrams and conceptual models that they had seen, and they're trying to describe it in certain terms. And I don't want to say quite that there's a game of telephone that was going on that he suspects, but it's more like misinterpretations creep in. So he thinks that these conceptual models are what was actually existing and what was Judaism really way back, or Jewish teaching way back. Okay. And then I suspect that elements in the 5 books of Moses and the Jewish stories are allegories that sometimes, or some of them, describe these conceptual models allegorically. And that then there's a third book. Okay, so that's Stan Tenon's work. And then there's another book by, you see, Stan Tenon, and then who's dead, and if he knows, if he's in communion with God, I'd love to find out what he knows now. There's another book by a non-Jew. Stan Tenon was Jewish, brought up on someone, he's Jewish. Not necessarily very knowledgeable early on, and not with a thorough Jewish upbringing, but he explored Jewish teachings late, at some point in his life. He grew up as a mathematician. He was very good at detecting patterns. There's another author who is not a Jew. His name is Russell Gamirkin. He wrote a book called something like Plato and Plato and the creation, Plato and the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, something like that. That was his first book. And then his second book is Berosus and Genesis, Manetho and Exodus. And there's a third book and a fourth book. His basic concept is that contrary to the documentary hypothesis, which has, the Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh-ist writer from this community, and the Elohim community has this writer, and part of that community has a priestly writer, and then somebody else wrote Deuteronomy, and there's an editor that wove these different texts together and so forth. Contrary to that, that's essentially hogwash. He figures that these were people who believed in Plato's ideas, which had been like 100 years prior to the writing of the 5 books of Moses, which he dates to 270 before the Common Era. And I think independently, the history, remember I mentioned that one priest wrote a history on Babylonia, the Babylonian Empire, which was occupied by Greece, and after Alexander conquering and so forth. And then Egypt had a priest, Manetho, who had written a 3-volume, which we don't have, we don't have the whole text of it, but we have historians' quotes from it. Manetho had written a 3-volume history of Egypt, and that was also occupied by the Greeks, or a proprietorship of the Greek Empire. So it's interesting that those two priests write their histories around 280, something like that, and then history says that the 5 books of Moses were then translated into a Greek translation around 270, right just after those other two priests write their histories. So he suspects, and there's other evidence around it, but this is a leading connection, a leading suspicion point that it wasn't just a translation into Greek. He suspects that that they were writing a history of their own culture, just as within the past, the decade prior, within that past decade, the Babylonian priest Berosus wrote a history of the Babylonian Empire, and the Manetho wrote a 3-volume history of the Egyptian Empire, or Egyptian culture. And it's like no coincidence, he suspects, that the 5 books of Moses were not only translated, they were written and then immediately translated, or soon afterward at some point. So his suspicion is that these commandments that are given in the Torah were actually written by, I'm not going to say Greeks, I mean people who were followers or adherents of Plato's philosophies, and that it was written in a style of a Greek foundation story where you have a hero leaving a land and then settling a new colony and then setting up a series of laws and so forth. It seems pretty persuasive. It jives with my understanding of what I've studied in Judaism. So he's written several books. He's tried to figure out, what text led to what seemed to be the source text that this writer was using. He guesses that originally, I'd have to look at my notes. I started writing these notes, but during an interview he had, that there was one mention of Moses leaving Egypt and then colonizing or setting up a colony, settling into Judea, and but it doesn't mention anything else. And then there's an elephantine papyrus that which exists more in that time, that contradicts some of the commandments about Passover that are given in the 5 books of Moses. The two seem to contradict, as if the 5 books of Moses didn't exist at the time the elephantine papyrus was written. So he suspects that, and obviously these were written by people who were literate in Hebrew because of those Hebrew word plays. It wasn't in Greek and then translated to Hebrew. It had to have been in Hebrew to begin with, because of those equidistant letter sequence patterns and so forth. And there are a bunch of other patterns that are hidden within the text, but they are there. And so his suspicion is that they were like fulfilling Plato's dream or ideal state. He idealized. He talked about this in his work Timaeus. He talks about what would be an ideal society, and he describes what this ideal society would be like. Russell Gamirkin's suspicion is that these writers were trying to form the Israelite. There was an Israel at the time. We know that because before that there's an Egyptian stela. There's an Egyptian monument or whatever, and there are references to Israel. But we don't know anything. That doesn't necessarily mean that the 5 books of Moses existed at that time. We don't know, that doesn't mean Aaron really existed. That doesn't mean the stuff that you read about actually happened. It just says Israel existed. His suspicion is that these were people trying to establish an ideal society, like form Israel into an ideal society that Plato envisioned about like 100 or something years before. They would have, and he figures out what sources they would have probably used at the Library of Alexandria. The writers probably referred to Manetho's History of Egypt, and the beginning part of Genesis was probably inspired by Berossus's history of how the world began. And of course, he found, of course, there may be. I'm open to debate, reading, listening to different sides. But from what he says and the way he argues it, it's pretty persuasive that the two creation stories, the beginning of Genesis, seem to tie in not necessarily with Middle Eastern culture. They seem to better tie in with Plato's ideal creation. That ties in with the third book, which is by I've seen his name as Mel Klein on Facebook. He has a website called chaver.com, chaver.com, and he writes a mini biography of himself, and at the end he gives his name as Moshe Klein. I'm guessing that's a nickname or something. I'm guessing that the birth name is Mel Klein. Anyway, Mel or Moshe Klein created this website called chaver.com, and I stumbled upon it. In fact, this is about 2006, 7, something, 16, 17, something like that, maybe 2015. I was in the middle of trying to write a book about how I think the Bible is actually constructed. And when I saw this website and this ongoing work at a book that was on his website, in other words, he's kind of formulating or at least publishing chapter by chapter this book. When I saw his formulation of how the Bible should be laid out, the hidden structure, how it really is hidden underneath, I thought, wow, better go back to square one. I think this guy beat me to it for the most part. Since then, he's published the entire thing for free. I mean, I read it for free, and I've gone back, at least in the past, sometime in the past year, I've gone back. It's still there. You can read it. However, I don't want to detract from those who want to buy a physical book. I want to hurt his book sales, but you can do what I did, which is read it for free online. It's a full-size book, so it's a lot of pages and a lot of scrolling, but I have patience. It means this much to me. So I'm just looking down there to see the time. Okay, so he says essentially that you can read it linearly, and people have read, for centuries, they've read the 5 books of Moses linearly. This happens, and then this happens, and this happens, and this happens. But as a reader, if you've ever read the Bible, you may have noticed there are certain repeating phrases, and there's certain questions you may have thought about, like, why does it keep doing it in this pattern? Like, for example, it may say, I am the Lord your God, and then it gives a commandment, and then another commandment, I am the Lord your God, and it gives another commandment, I am the Lord your God. Why does it do that? Why is the phraseology like structured or repeated, or it seems to repeat itself ad infinitum? It seems to be very formulaic, especially in Leviticus. Well, there's that, and then there are elements in the actual Hebrew text, the lettering in the Hebrew text. Anytime when you translate into another language, you miss those patterns that you get in the original language. I mean, in the actual lettering itself, the sequences of letters, the pattern is lost when you translate it. So he found that those may be breaks or signal markers, and so you can read it entirely linearly, or you can take each book and divide the verses. After so many verses, it seems to be divided, and then some verses seem to parallel each other. So that gives you a clue that somehow visually, like graphically, if you break them up into units, these verses into units or collections of like three or four verses or whatever into units, separate units, they seem to visually form a pattern. And there's more to it. There's an upper layer and a middle. In Genesis, it forms a matrix, what I call a matrix, like a top layer, middle layer, a bottom layer. Like the column all the way to one side is there are three creation myths. I count the flood story as the third creation story. You have the Elohim. You have chapter 1 creation story where it's just Elohim, and it's that top level. And then you have the Garden of Eden story, and that seems in the creation of the Adam, and then Eve split off from the Adam. Which, by the way, the Jewish conception is that the Adam wasn't male; it was just a being. And then you separate Chava. In Hebrew, Chava means life or living, and it's been translated into Greek and so forth. Her name became Eve, but it's Chava split off, and that's when you get male and female. But the Jewish conception is that the original being was just an androgynous, means no gender, androgynous being. And there's a line in there it says in the text, it says that's why a man leaves his mother and clings to his wife. It's just very nice. I think that's very nice. It's like the two to become one flesh. I think it actually says, and they become one flesh. It's like the two were separated, and that's like kind of the motivation, at least from a male perspective. I'm seeking out someone. It's like my other self, like sort of trying to seek a partner. By the way, the Jewish concept of Adam and Eve, Eve's role has been mistranslated and misinterpreted in English translations and so forth. The term is actually that Yud He Vav He says Adam is alone. I will create and it says helpmate or helpmeet. The actual Hebrew it's a two-word combination. One word means sturdy or strong or girding, and the other means something like alternate. So the concept is more like pushing against or counterpart, or I would translate it as a strong counterpart. It's not this slave thing where the slave, the woman adheres to what the man's. That's nothing. No, the actual Hebrew would translate more accurately as I will create. The Adam is alone. I will create a strong counterpart for him. That's the way I would translate it. That seems to be what the actual Hebrew is saying. Okay. Boy, I've talked quite a bit. Okay, so let me give you a preview. I've been giving you previews all along, but ultimately what he found at the conclusion, when he finally published all the chapters, and I got to read the final chapter and so forth, it seems to form, I know Christians are going to go hog wild when I say this, but it seems to form a cross. And it's not just a haphazard formation of a cross. It's based on patterns, so it's at different levels of resolution. So each section of a book seems to have units that can be split up into units, and then each book seems to be able to have its units fall like pictorially, graphically, as what I would call a matrix. Because you have rows and columns, and they're thematically, and word-wise, in terms of word choice and phrase usage, they seem to fit in patterns. That's at the book level, and then when you have all 5 books, and we know that those 5 books must have been written at once, so in some sense, that totally destroys the documentary hypothesis that says that these were all different texts that were just stitched together. because remember I said there's an equidistant letter sequence pattern. The first two books begin with Torah spelled forwards, and the final two books Torah backwards. And in the middle, it's Yud Hey Vav Hey that's written with a 7-letter skip pattern. So it must have been written, and those verses, with where the skip letter pattern is within refers to both Elohim and Yud Hey Vav Hey, two different names. So you literally could not have this pattern, this equidistant letter pattern, without both names being used, which again destroys this idea that you had one writer using God's name this way and another one using Elohim as another God's name. It totally destroys that. So finally, you have all 5 books. You have Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, and then reading across, you have Genesis, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. And he speculates, it seems like one is the Exodus going this way. This path seems to be a path from like a journey, and this seems to have a journey of its own. I can't remember exactly how that is. Leviticus is right in the middle, and these two, and then there are different units. I'm not saying chapters, but I mean when you break them up, not by verse, but by like collections of verses into units. Each book has a certain number of units, and seems these two, this vertical and this horizontal, these books add up to a certain number of units, and then this book and this book seem to add up to the same number of units. Of course, they both share Leviticus in the middle, so that's kind of irrelevant. So it turns out that Leviticus in the middle breaks up into two matrices, and so one pattern is that the ones going across have a formation of a matrix with rows and columns. So Genesis is entirely a matrix of rows and columns. It's a grid. And then in the middle you have 2 grids. And then the final one is simply, again, a grid like Genesis. Deuteronomy is, Deuteronomy, right, is like Genesis. They're both one grid of so many columns. And then here, Leviticus breaks up into 2 grids, and with a central, what I think he calls it a unique unit. There's a unique unit between the 2 grids, and that, by the way, is chapter 19, where it says, it gives a whole bunch of commandments and says, I am the Lord your God. A whole bunch of commandments, and then says again, I am the Lord your God, and a whole bunch of commandments. It's as if the central thing within the entire 5 books of Moses is Yud Hey Vav Hey, saying, I am Yud Hey Vav Hey, your God. It's elegant. Wow. That's the fascination I find in this whole thing. That's what motivates me to understand and recognize more and more and pursue this understanding of this underlying structure. By the way, this cross, Christians could say, oh, look, a cross. It was intended from the very beginning. My guess is, and I think the author goes into this too, that Ezekiel's wheel, the first chapter in Ezekiel describes a framework, a wheel floating, and he describes it, and he says there are 4 a chariot. It's also called the chariot. There are 4 creatures, and so forth. I think what he's describing, or one aspect of it I think he's describing, is the zodiac, the corner 4 directional, cardinal points on a zodiac. Because of those creatures, the heads, there's a bull, and there's I think a bird, and there's a human, and so forth. It seems to be related to the zodiac. And then this right here could be interpreted as the cardinal points in the chariot. Having those 4 things like And then in the center you have Leviticus, which makes total sense. Right in the middle you have the commandment, you have the Torah. All those commandments, the bulk of those commandments are given in Leviticus, right in the middle. All right, so you have Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, and they don't follow pictorially. They don't break up into a grid, an easy grid pattern. They break up into a more pictorial pattern. However, they all have one thing in common: that picture or that arrangement seems to have a unique unit, what he calls a unique unit, and their characteristics of that unique unit that separate it from the units in the rows and columns. Right in the middle goes with Exodus, goes with Leviticus. You find it right in the middle between the two matrices, and then you find it in Numbers. And then going across, you have that you don't have the unique unit right in the middle. You have a grid pattern. In Genesis, you have it in Leviticus, which is the two separate grid patterns, as if to point to, Genesis and Deuteronomy, and you have that unique unit. So Leviticus complies with the that formulation you see this way, and the formulation you see this way with the unique unit. So I need to, after all this, I still need to do a new video because I need to explain all that Stan Tenen stuff in Meru, the Meru Foundation stuff. You can find it. There's a Meru Foundation YouTube channel. You can find that stuff, and he has a whole bunch of lectures, and there are at least 46 different videos talking about his work. So I encourage you to watch those. And I will see you next time. Again, as usual, if you like this stuff, I certainly think this is of value. Please, sorry for this, again, shaving. It'll heal at some point. But please like this video. It certainly boosts boosts the channel overall. And I talk about stuff like that. I talk about very important stuff that I enjoy and I value, and I think it's worthwhile to spread my knowledge and awareness of these things. A lot of the stuff that I talk about, I suspect not many people know about. So that's really the guiding force, the mission statement for this channel. So, and I will, the more support I'll get, the more decoration I can put back here, and the more the fancier I can make this YouTube channel into. And then of course I'll do that, and then of course YouTube will go out of business or whatever. No, but the more support I can get, the more money I can be put into it, and so forth. More effort and so forth. More pride on it. So, anyway, like this video, I hope, and subscribe to the channel if you want to watch more stuff like this. And I don't only talk about the Bible, I talk about things going on in my life, and specifically with the purpose of perhaps opening your eyes up or introducing you to something to understand yourself better, or the universe itself out there better. And also I have those things on Amazon Kindle. They're only ebooks at this point, but I'm adding stuff on more and more. So please look at that. I have links below to many of these videos already, and I'll see you next time.